Do they still say lights, camera, action?
Well, we take the first two for granted these days.
Really? It's just the foreshortening of discourse. Today we're going to be talking about the structural differential, which is one of the, which is probably the most important device in general semantics. Now the structural differential, as you may not be surprised to hear, if you were here last week, introducing it, was aimed at an entire population, all the way from kindergarten students to even perhaps younger people, all the way up to the elites of science and humanities in the Anglosphere. So obviously this is a device that could be put to many different uses and internalized and applied in many different ways. I remember reading in the Journal of the Movement, etc., a story that was sent in by a mother who was recounting an experience with her 5-year-old daughter, maybe 6 or 7, not young. He brought a playmate over to the house for the first time to play, and the playmate noticed in her room a structural differential hanging on the wall. And so now you know that it's something that can be hung on the wall. And she said, "What on earth is that?" And the kid said, "What? Have you never seen a structural differential before?" Now you can be sure that although for 5 or 6-year-old practice of a structural differential could go very deeply than it could for someone like ourselves who are introduced to it only perhaps in our early 20s or thereabouts. It might go deeper with you than for someone who's introduced to it in their 50s or 60s. But I've been thinking about it and applying it for many years now. So on my way over here today, I had a completely new, what should we call it? Let's call it an idea. So I'm going to introduce the structural differential in this really weird way, which has never been done before. And then I'm going to go on to some business that we have to transact before we can get back to work. So let's say in the beginning, which is where we're at, which is where we're always 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 at, in the beginning. There was nothing. And then all of a sudden there was something. Remember Heidegger saying that the question was, that the question for philosophers, so I suppose we're philosophizing now, the question for philosophers is, why is there something rather than nothing? So we could call this something cosmos. We could be thinking of the first line of Genesis. In the beginning, the Lord God created the heavens and the earth. The first word of the Bible is Bereshit, in the beginning. Or you could be thinking, if you're more modern, what would have come to mind first, even before the first words of the Bible, what might have come to your mind is the Big Bang. That's the beginning, is it not? According to our science, 2009. So we could call this cosmos, or perhaps we could call it chaosmos. We'll see soon enough that this corresponds to the event level in Korzybski's structural differential cosmos, the event. But the very idea of cosmos is a kind of closed order. The very idea of cosmos, you don't bother correcting me if I'm wrong. I could be wrong, but we have no time to waste on it. For me, cosmos means an order, a fixed order, closed order. We can discover things within the cosmos that are new, but we can't discover anything that is fundamentally new within the cosmos. But the event level of the structural differential is open at the top, as we see. That means it's not a fixed order of things, rather it's a process of happenings. So before the Big Bang, nothing was happening. Split second after the Big Bang, happenings are happening. And happenings are happening. Happenings of happenings are happening. And happenings of happenings of happenings are happening. And it's happenings indefinitely into the future. There is no closure.
But I want.
There never will have been closure. One day, according to the Bible, it's the first day. The first day or later on in that 6-day series. Anyway, one of those days, within, we could also call this what is going on, which is a term I introduced last week. What is going on? W-I-G-O. So within what is going on, on a certain day, experience started happening. Before that time, there was no experiencing. There were happenings, but no experiencings. So on this day, experiencings began. Or perhaps we could also add to that, evaluatings. You notice I'm not saying experiences and I'm not saying evaluations. Later on it will be easier to appreciate my choice of words. Experiencings are happening, evaluatings are happening. And I was wondering how to picture that. So of course the first thing that comes to mind is an eye. It's the eye of thought or the eye of consciousness. But hey, experiencings and evaluatings are older than that. It's not as if first there was only happenings without a thinker, and then thought or consciousness or thinking appeared. It's not about thinking, although thinking is a kind of experiencing and evaluating. But here I'm devaluating the role of thoughts right from the start. Well, the I is traditionally in Western thought associated with an I, a subject of consciousness and of thinking. So I didn't want to go there, as they say. So a mere half an hour ago, it came to me that I should picture this as a heart right now. You may think that's hokey, but if you can come up with a better way of quickly picturing evaluatings or experiencings, which are sort of closer, in a sense, to feeling than to thought, then you could let me know. The great mathematician, philosopher Alfred North Whitehead, who was one of the influences on Korzybski, and to whose work I'll be briefly referring in the future from time to time, actually created a cosmology, a sort of totalizing philosophy of everything. One of the main points of which is that experiencing actually goes all the way down. He would say that the minute there was happening, there was already experiencing. But that's quite a radical thing, so I'll just mention it. We like to think that experiencings or evaluatings didn't begin with subatomic particles or stardust, as Whitehead, I think, would argue. That experiencings or evaluatings began with life, plant life. plants live. I remember once reading a science fiction story about, I forget who the author was, about someone who developed a heightened sense of empathic sort of sensory experiencing where he couldn't bear to hear the lawn mowed because he could hear the screaming of the grass as it was cut. And then, you know, after more time passes, we get, by the way, Korzybski calls this the object level. So we have an event level, and within the event level arises the object level. Choice of terms isn't always the most fortunate, but you know, he was not a native English speaker, and he was doing the best he could. So further on, as we go further on, something else happens with, you know, I just got to go back to the structural differential, to its way of picturing this, because I haven't thought of anything startling or creatively original on my own. I just thought of this half an hour ago. I may be the first professor you've met for a while who had a new idea half an hour before the class. I don't want to brag or anything. It's probably a neurosis.
It shows you don't plan ahead.
Well, I do plan ahead, but then things happen around planning that kind of disrupt or bother it. And I don't know if I'm ever going to finish the first term. Of course, at this rate. If I keep having any idea, ideas, you know, then you'll never get your degree. And that's what Korzybski calls the label levels. So within life, then, there's this moment where language appears. What Korzybski calls the label level. So within the object, within the realm of experience and evaluating, verbal experiencing and verbal evaluating, or conceptualizing, verbalizing, talking, saying things. And these are a whole bunch of levels as we see. We've got talking about what is going on, we've got talking, saying about what we've talked, we've got saying about saying, and saying about saying, and saying about saying about saying. Korzybski calls these, let's call them the count. It takes only one syllable, 2 syllables, all the way up to the top. Where it feeds back into what is going on. Our thinking, theorizing, talking, conceptualizing, feeds back into what is going on. Not only in such a way that it gives us what we think of as our knowledge of what is going on, but also, as I indicated for the first time last week, it actually helps to make what is going on conform to what we think is going on. And in terms of the notion of identification that I mentioned before, it makes things the same as their concepts, or at least tends to make things the same as their concepts. Structural differential has never been introduced that way before. I'm sure that probably never will be again, and it's probably not necessarily a bad thing. But we have to keep ourselves amused to it. So, back to business. This is one version of the structural differential. I'll talk about it later. There's no text in this course. There is one thing that I'm going to ask you to read pretty soon, written by Korzybski, the founder of this movement called General Semantics, which is what I'm taking off from. Since we lack what is usually thought of as a text for the course, then the material I verbally present here myself week after week is the text. Now this presents certain constraints and limitations upon you as a fourth-year university student. Yes, it imposes the constraint of regular, religious, almost ritualized, compulsive, regular attendance. Because the proceedings are cumulative. It's not as if we have 12 books, and if you miss 6, it's not as if we have 12 books and there's a class per book, so if you miss 6 books, at least you've got the 6 others. It's not serial. It's not serially structured like that. It's cumulative. In other words, each class builds upon the one that preceded it, and so on. And in fact, it has more of a spiral structure, and the spiral plays an important role in the kind of work that we'll be doing here, as we'll see. So it's not only a matter of cumulative in the sense of you can't really walk in here and understand what's going on, because what's going on here depends on what happened here. That would be really difficult. It's a little bit easier than that because with each turn of the spiral, there's some repetition. There's some repetition of what has happened before, which is in the nature of spiral, right? However, what is repeated is not the same, because that would be identifying what's going to happen 6 weeks from now. If I talk about identification 6 weeks from now, it won't have exactly the same meaning as it had when I introduced the concept yesterday. The context and the time will have changed, and therefore the meaning will have changed. I should just mention that this term chaosmos that I threw out there, it's what Korzybski will call a non-elementalistic term. Elementalism being that which separates in language happenings that are not separate in what is going on. So an example I gave last time is the word evaluation, which does not separate thinking and feeling, because evaluation always involves both thinking and feeling. Chaosmos doesn't separate chaos and cosmos. It doesn't separate, disorder from order, because order is the ordering of disorder. Without disorder, there would be no order. So chaosmos is talking about this infinite, at least until the sun goes into supernova in our galaxy, this infinite process of the ordering of order. The ordering of disorder. Disorder arises out of order, and so on. You could diagram it this way, which is a way of diagramming that I will recur to frequently. Now, I found that term first in a French thinker named Edgar Morin. I'll be referring to his work perhaps much later in the term, if we get to it. But then I remembered that I probably first saw this term, or something like it, in work of Felix Guattari. He was not Italian. He was not French, he was Italian. Not far from the coast. An immense distance from the coast. But he did work with Deleuze for the next kind of half-age. I know he wrote a book called Chaosophy. My radical version of general semantics, I hope, is a kind of chaosophy. Can anyone tell me whether chaosmos also appears in the discourse of Deleuze and Guattari? If not, good, very well. Right. Good. It's nice to be right.
I think Lev told me once that it appears in Deleuze as well.
Sorry?
Lev once told me that it appears in Capitalism and Schizophrenia.
Okay.
I think he told me. I could be wrong.
Right. Okay. It's just a footnote. I like to show that I've read stuff. Whoops. All right, so now there's no more stalling. We got to go directly to Korzybski's presentation of the structure. structural differential is called that for two reasons. First of all, it differentiates. It differentiates levels of what is going on. Some people would say levels of reality. I prefer to say levels of what is going on. Levels of existence and reality, levels of what is going on. I really do prefer levels. It differentiates levels. Thus, it's a differential. And it's a structural differential for two reasons. I might as well start with this. No, I won't. It's structural for two reasons. It is an actual structure, a physical structure that children and others can not only look at in the distanced mode of identification, representation, they can actually get into it. They can not only look at it, but feel it, because it's a structure, a physical structure. Now, of course, it usually appears in the form of a two-dimensional diagram. But Korzybski really preferred for people to practice with the structural differential, not just to look at it, but to practice with the structural differential by not only looking at it, but handling it and feeling it. I'll show you later one version of it that a student made many years ago in this course. So this is the only place where this version will have appeared. There's the event level. So does this remind you of the stuff I was saying at the beginning of the hour? And there's an object level. And there's a label. Levels. The event level is a parabola, open at the top. In the structure, it has, well, in either diagram or the structure, it has a whole bunch of holes in it. Korzybski made it himself and patented it in 1924-25. Each of these holes represents, in our first take on the structural differential, we can say each of these holes represents a characteristic. Later on, we'll see that the term characteristic disguises a lot more than it expresses. But it's important to have those holes because from the holes, Korzybski lets strings fall. And the strings go to the next level, which is the object level. Well, this is the level of whatever is going on. Korzybski likes to call it the level of submicroscopic process going on indefinitely. Subatomic particles whirling without end. So it certainly does refer to a microscopic and submicroscopic level of what is going on. But really it refers to whatever is going on at a particular moment. And by the way, strictly speaking, the structural differential refers to a moment in time, although it can be taken in other ways as well. Korzybski calls it a cross-section of the process. So at a moment, we take a cross-section of the process. And this is whatever is going on. And this is the level of sensory experience and evaluation. Korzybski is very clear that sensory experience, perception, I think we could call it perception, sensory experience, what we see, hear, but not just what we see and hear out there, also what we see and hear and feel. Korzybski puts it this way, inside and outside the skin. It's the level of sensory experience inside and outside the skin. So for philosophers who are into David Hume, there's all kinds of false Humean problems that are avoided at this point. The point where Korzybski says inside and outside the skin. You don't need to see something out there to be sure that it exists. because what I feel as a living bodily being, what I feel as a living bodily being also somehow informs me in relation about what is going on. So this is the level of sensory experience. The event level, what is going on beyond our capacities for immediate perception, inside and outside of the skin. The object level, the level of sensory experience, the seen, heard, felt, smelled, tasted, inside and outside the skin. It includes our feelings as, for example, non-verbal or pre-verbal evaluations or meanings, including the feeling of being alive, including the sense of time, including the sense of causation as like at the protoplasmic level, if I move towards an item of food, I assume that my movement towards it is going to cause its ingestion. Okay? The experience of causation, not a philosophical theory of causation. Those are at the object level. The label level, what we say, and here also there are holes. And at the label level, representing characteristics of sensory experience. And notice that the object level leaves out a lot of characteristics of what is going on. Leaves out a lot of what is going on. As a matter of fact, we could say it leaves out, at the object level, we leave out almost all of what is going on. There's a very, very small part of what is going on that is received by ourselves as living beings in the sensory perceptual feeling world. And then there's what we say about what we experience. Label level 1. And then label level 2, what we say about what we say. There's many different ways we could talk about this. Korzybski calls it multi-ordinal. That just means many-leveled. Multi-ordinal. What is going on is multi-ordinal. And this is one of the main differences between the Aristotelian approach, which is linear, and the non-Aristotelian approach, which, although it can take account of lines, is not linear, is multi-ordinal. What we say about what we say, what we say about what we say about what we say. All the way up to, as far as we can go, which would say L to the nth, which is the very highest level of abstraction. Here, I just introduced the term. I'll go back and use it again in a minute. It's the very highest level of abstraction, which in Korzybski's structure is actually attached to the event level with a safety net. It feeds back into, as I said before, in my original crazy version of the structure of the version. For example, up here we have E equals mc squared. It's at this level that we have what we think is our knowledge. So I'm not saying what we know is our knowledge, or what we know. I'm saying at this level we have what we think is our knowledge of what is going on. So at this highest level of abstraction, we have E equals mc squared. We have Marx's theory of commodities. We have whatever higher level and middle level theories about what is going on. You know, I think there's no end to the proliferation of modifications that are possible in the structure of differential. So I always try to more or less stick to it, problematic though it may be in certain ways. I mean, you know, you could also move like this. You don't necessarily have to go all the way to the top before coming back in. But it's very important to appreciate the circularity here. recursive, self-referential, circular kind of process. We'll see later how important that is. And as a footnote, in many presentations of the structure differential that you can find out there, that's locked off. Because for some people, let's say, for many Americans, it represented an unnecessary complication. That's where I'm going. So what's the role of the term abstraction? The object level, what we see, hear, feel, etc., is not what is going on. I already did that last week. It's not what is going on. It's part of what's going on. It's a level of what is going on. It's an abstraction from the event. So, for example, what we hear as sound, I mean, if we hear it, it's sound, right? Sound is what is heard. So sound is an abstraction from what is going on at this level as air pressure waves. So here we have air pressure wave. Here we have sound. Here we have the word sound, labeled for the experience at the lowest level of abstraction. And here we have talk about sound. And then we have talk about sound. And here we have musicology. Right? And if you think that musicology doesn't play a role in determining what we hear, that's a really good example. I should make a note of. This is why my notes are so messy, because I won't leave well enough alone for neurosis. So you know that old, supposed to be a riddle about if a tree falls in the forest and there's no living being around to hear it? Does it make a sound? What's the answer? Albert's ready with the answer. So if a tree falls in the forest and there's no living being around to hear it, does it make a sound? Huh? No. No, it doesn't, because without the ear, there will be no sound. Without some kind of auditory nervous system processing, there will be no sound. There will be, according to our science, air pressure waves. Now, nobody ever heard, saw, or felt an air pressure wave. It's our science that tells us what is going on at the event level. It's air pressure waves, and then we hear it as sound. I suppose my brother Asher won't object too much if I share with you one of his favorite jokes as a married man. So my brother's question is, as a married man, if a man says something in the forest and there's no woman there to hear him, is he still wrong?
Yes.
Yes. That's the answer. That's a quick solution to the problem. It reminds me of my niece Sarah's answer to the medieval Christian Jewish problem of whether the Almighty God is so powerful that he can create a rock that is so heavy that even he cannot lift it. And Sarah immediately answered, yes. So that was the end of that one.
How old was Sarah?
At the time?
At the time.
To,
Context being everything, yeah.
yeah, date in that case. 6 or 7. Yeah. 6 or 7. Now the structural differential, Korzybski meant it. Before I go in there, maybe I'll show you this. Now, if Scott Bizzell had not come to class with this many, many years ago, I wouldn't remember his name. But I do remember his name, and I remember him, sort of. In fact, he even came to visit me years later, and I asked him what he was up to, and he said he was studying problems of juvenile delinquency, and I've never heard from him again, so I guess the problems were intractable. But because it's important to understand that the levels are all contained within what is going on, but they're not, see, in Korzybski's structure and in this diagram, they occupy separate spaces, which can be misleading, because these levels are not separate. they are simultaneous. Or as simultaneous as it's possible to be, given that there's no absolute simultaneity. So Scott made one where you got the parabola open at the top, you've got the holes, you've got the little strings coming out of the hole, and then you've got the object level popping out, and then you've got the label level. All the way up to the highest label level attached to the event level of the safety. Isn't that wonderful? And in later years, a student tried to make a small version of the structured differential, which could be used as a keychain. It was too small to really work, so I guess I didn't even keep it. What a shame. So anyway, there we go. Now, in all the years that I've been following the general semantics movement, and I have, although it's been trailing off lately because they're all dying, and the newer generation are even more American than the predecessors, if that is possible. I mean, even more liberal, even more inclined to treat general semantics as just another course in self-improvement which would assist people in succeeding within the established order, which is really not what Korzybski had in mind. It's the only, like, Scott is the only one who thought of producing this kind of version of the structured differential, as far as I know. So, you know, I hope he's had a nice life since then. Korzybski meant people to practice with this, not only in their thinking. So, in your thinking, you go, in your thinking at the very least, you go, hey, the label is not the object. Whatever you say it is not. That's it. One of Korzybski's little formulas. Whatever you say it is not. This has some startling implications and consequences if you take it seriously enough. For example, if you think about your so-called self, whatever I say I am not. And whatever you say you are not. It's not that it's all a tissue of lies. It's a denial not of relevance or something like that, or even of usefulness. It's a denial of identity. It's not saying you are nothing. It's saying I am not what I say I am. What I say I am Horowitz, professor, Radical General Semantics, Torontonian, Canadian, Jew, Zionist. Whatever I say I am, I'll never come to the end of attributes. That's the etc. So whatever I say I am, there'll be more on the self if we want that, on the so-called self. So the label is not the object, and the object is not the event. And the label and object together, which I put this way because that's usually the way we experience things, with object and label sort of together, but which more shortly. So whatever I say, and whatever I say hyphen experience is not the same as. The object is not the event, the label is not the object. But if you're working with a structural differential, Korzybski says you can actually, if you're practicing with it, you can actually go, hey, the label, you can feel it, is not the object. The object is not the event. You can not only see it, but feel it, because Korzybski thought it was very important in education to educate the senses. Philosophy. Every few hundred years, some philosopher says, wouldn't it be a great idea to educate the senses? And then they forget about it. Like, how? I know there have been some important educational theorists, Montessori and things like that, who pay some attention to sensory education. Maybe I should know more about it, but still. And Korzybski says you can also point and go. Shh. Shh. This is not this. So shh. This is not this. Shh. If you want to characterize it as a negative epistemology, you could say general semantics is a negative epistemology. That's probably not adequate enough. But then, it's in the neighborhood of negative dialectic. You might want to think that, but of course it's also a million miles away. Because I can't understand negative dialectic. And I'm an intellectual. So the one statement of Korzybski which has come down to us, which I mentioned last week, the map is not declaratory. This is what it means. And you can imagine how it's misinterpreted and misused by people who repeat it. Usually in the course of an argument about reality as corresponding to their thought. Hey, the map is not declaratory. Hey, the reality is. Korzybski calls this training in non-identification, and he also calls it neural linguistic training. Neural linguistic training, because it involves not only language but the whole neurology, the whole nervous system. So it's neural linguistic training. He says that if you practice with the structural differential, you as nervous system is training itself in non-identification. There's this neat little thing that I should have mentioned when I introduced the label level. I even could have mentioned it in what I'm now calling my crazy version of the structured differential that I began with Big Bang, experience, and evaluation. And then there's blah blah, right? Language. Korzybski uses this term blah blah to refer to pointless or useless identifying type language, but here I'm sort of going to the limit and using it as a synonym for language itself. So blah blah. When does language? Lots of thinkers, the most famous of whom is perhaps Rousseau, speculated about the origin of language and the very close relationship between language phenomenon and the human phenomenon. But there's this anthropologist, American anthropologist named Edward Hall, wrote a bunch of popular books about anthropology. In one of them he suggests, it's a kind of joke but it's also true, that language happened not when the first cavemen started talking about their experience, because then people can say, well, chimps and apes and types like that also make noises that sort of refer to their experience. So human beings are not the only ones who have language, you know. I'm sure you've heard that. So maybe it's true that human beings are not the only ones who have language. But what Hall points out is that human beings are the only ones who can talk about language. So Hall evokes this scenario in which a bunch of cavemen are sitting around grunting in a manner of referring in an auditory way to their experiences, and then all of a sudden one of them says, hey, guess what, guys, or guess what, comrades, guess what, we are talking. So that's the dawn of humanity there. not the talking, but the talking about talking. Hey, we're talking. And you see, that's the multi-ordinality. Hey, we're talking. So this is already, maybe mere talking is in there somewhere. And this would be already talking about talking, because as I speak, I know that I'm speaking. I think it doesn't take very long in terms of child development for the child not only to speak, but to know that he or she is speaking. I should also, to fill in here a little bit, in the original structure of differential, there's another object level here, which is the animal level. Korzybski first invented this to demonstrate the difference between humans and animals. And the difference between humans and animals is that human beings have language and culture. And the animal abstracts from the event level at the object level, but does not know that it is abstracting, cannot come anywhere near knowing that it is abstracting, that its sensory experience is actually an abstraction from what is going on. So the animal automatically identifies its experience with what is going on. And when Korzybski is really being mean to human beings in terms of getting really impatient with their habits of identity thinking, he says that they are copying animals. Copying animals by not living the distinction between label, event, object, and event levels, being categorical and dogmatic. That's his idea of humor. Now look at this. Now you'll never guess what it is, unless some of you already know. Some of you may already know what it is. This is a snowflake. It's a snowflake, magnified. Tells you down here what order of magnification there is here. I can't figure it out though. It tells you down here something about what order of magnification is involved, but it's a snowflake. So my question is, what is this really? My first impulse, which was mistaken, was to say that this is a snowflake at the event level, which is revealed to us by our magnification technology. But that wouldn't be correct. What we have here is a new object level, which is opened up by our technology, because we can see that. So it's at the object level for us. And it's just one order of magnification. There can be many different orders of magnification. You know, we could magnify less, we could magnify more, and we'd get different things to see with every different order of magnification. So it's the techno-object level. You know, somebody could formulate a less clumsy term. An object level that's opened up for us by the technology, like they tell us that they're constantly discovering new planets, you know, that go around stars other than old Sol. Well, as a matter of fact, they're not doing anything of the kind. They are engaging in manipulations up here with their technology from which they infer that there are new planets being discovered there. And the science journalists and the scientists themselves have the gall to talk in terms of discovery of new planets. You see, that's misleading the public, certainly, and themselves even perhaps, about what it is that the technology is actually doing and how it's actually being used, which is a problem, if you like, in Aristotelian as opposed to non-Aristotelian science. Yeah.
Whatever it is that we're given, snowflake or not, right? When the question is asked, what is this really? Don't we then get into the label level at that point when we're asked?
Absolutely. I mean, this is supposed to be a joke, the question, what is it really? See, at the event level, something is happening. which is received by us at the object level. In our natural primate object level, we receive it as what we commonly call a snowflake. And here at the techno object level, we receive it this way, and there are many other possible ways of receiving it at the techno object level. So the very question, what is it really, is hereby abolished. We don't ask that anymore. The day has come. And we don't ask that anymore. What is it really? Or what am I really? Or what is human nature? Or what is justice? Or what is love? Okay?
Maybe don't.
Really. I mean really. In that connection, remember the other day when I was informing you, as if you didn't already know it, that the experience of solidity here is what this, we can say this is what's happening at the object level. This experience of solidity, it resists penetration in E prime. By the way, you can hand up your E prime tasks and probably comment on them and return them to you next week. But then it occurred to me, I don't actually know what physics says about this phenomenon. I mean, I know that at the object level it resists penetration. I can feel it. I can hear it. Fortunately, I have a brother, 3 years younger, who's a physicist. And he works at the University of the Negev in Shabbat. And I asked him, how would you explain to an artsy? Can we still use the term artsy? Okay. How would you explain to an artsy with hardly any understanding of physics how it happens that we experience the dance of subatomic particles as solidity? How is it that we experience the dance of subatomic particles as solidity? Now, some of you may know, especially because I already told you last week, but even apart from that, some of you may have known this, but I didn't know it until my brother explained it to me. It occurred to me again, well, I'm an intellectual, and I don't even know how the dance of subatomic particles gets to be experienced as solidity. So what kind of science are you thinking? You know, if you find a physics student out there and ask them, I wonder if they'll be able to tell you. We might know about the dance of subatomic particles, but I wonder if they could explain to you how the dance of subatomic particles gets experienced by us as solidity. This is real. It's real at the object. It's not an illusion. So Eli writes back, are you the artsy? Oh, that's pretty insightful. Anyway, it's not a dumb question at all. The subatomic particles, the electrons in the outer orbitals, are so many and move so fast that it is as if it is a solid. The repulsive force that we feel, i.e. we cannot penetrate into matter, that repulsive force that we feel, and see, I had already used this formulation, resists penetration in time, and he comes up with it, confirming it autonomously in his response. The repulsive force that we feel is actually an electric force. The repulsive force between our electrons in here, and the electrons in the other boundary. It is a world that our senses, intuition cannot penetrate, which is of course used by many to maintain that there are many other worlds that our senses, intuition cannot penetrate. And this is where physicists spin off in the fence. Right? But not Egon, he's a very practical kind of guy. He's got to be living in Beersheba with a bomb shelter in his basement. So, this was going somewhere. Probably come back to me in a second. Yes. I said that this is not an illusion. Now, if you catch some smart aleck physicists out there, I don't know if there are any around here, in the Ministry of Truth. By the way, I refer to this at Smith Building as the Ministry of Truth, and I encourage people to adopt that nomenclature. It's slowly catching on, very slowly over the years. So I don't know if there's any physicists here at the Ministry of Truth, but maybe they will say, oh, well, it's just an illusion. Some of those types like to tell us that the whole world of our experience is an illusion, and general semantics can be distorted in many ways, and that's one of them. It can be distorted to support the illusion that all of our experience is illusory. But the structural differential is a differential, it's not a reducing device. That is, we don't say that reality is not solid. We don't say that what is going on is mostly empty space. We don't say that our experience of solidity is just an illusion. And we don't say you're nothing but a pack of neurons, which is what some neurological reductionists like to say these days. You're nothing but a pack of neurons. Was it famously who was responsible for saying that? Daniel Dennett or somebody like that? Minsky. I don't know, someone who's discovered the non-existence of God. I want to know how you discover the non-existence of something. Anyway, that's reductionism. That's what we call reductionism. That would be to reduce the object level to the event level insofar as we use the term event level to refer to that realm of a subatomic process. Now that's just another form of identifying levels. It's the scientific form of identifying levels. So it's Aristotelian rather than non-Aristotelian science. It's Aristotelianism in reverse. If you take Aristotelianism as identifying label and object event, then Aristotelianism in reverse would be denying the reality of object and label and insisting on the reality solely of that which our scientists up here are telling us today is the real, which of course will be different 5 years from now. That's why in Korzybski's diagrams of structural differential, they always put a date up here. In Science and Sanity, it's 1933, and today it's 2020. And there's a story that I picked up in the work by Charles Biederman. Those of you who are interested in the history of art and who have lots of time to spare can Google Charles Biederman, and you'll find that as an artist and art historian, he was also influenced by Korzybski. Everywhere here and there's the odd duck who's influenced by Korzybski. And Biederman entered into a correspondence with a famous philosopher-physicist, David Bohm. How many of you have heard of Bohm? Famous philosopher-physicist. And there's a book called The Bohm-Biederman Correspondence, big heavy volume. Imagine an artist entering into that big a dialogue with a physicist philosopher. Anyway, in his book, The Search for New Arts, by Charles Biederman, which no reputable publisher would publish, which he had to publish with his own vanity press. He just died at the age of 92. I can tell you more about Biederman, but we're back in time. So anyway, in The Search for New Arts, page 75, he writes, when Max Born's wife, Max Born was one of the pioneering generation of physicists around the time of the discovery of the theory of relativity, etc., on the turn of the century, a real revolution in science which has a lot to do with the development of general semantics. So Max Born was one of these guys, and his wife expressed her disturbance over what seemed like the determination of science to reduce everything to equations. It's conceivable they will, said Einstein, who was present at the dinner. So it's conceivable that scientists will reduce everything to equations, but don't worry. The equations will forever be inadequate. Something like representing a Beethoven symphony by air pressure waves. So Einstein himself had that sharp an understanding of the nonsense that's involved in reductionism. Would be something like representing the Beethoven Symphony by air pressure. Now, there were two sort of questions or comments that were coming up, which I ran over roughshod somewhere. One was here.
Yeah, why the parabola?
Because it's very important, because it's open at the top, because it's process happening incessantly because there's no end to it, so we can't know all about it. We'll never know all about it. It's always open. So it's a way of demonstrating, etc. There's always more. There's always more that will have happened.
So those lines are extended.
Yes. And a lot of the sort of drive of, I won't say Western thought, I'll say, because it's too easy to pick on Western thought as if Eastern thought was definitely a lot better in every way, but it's part of the drive of thought to close it. So now we've got fundamental laws, and everything falls out of the fundamental laws. We can improve our knowledge, but that wouldn't involve any alteration of any kind of fundamental understanding. So that's why the openness of the parabola at the top, as I put it, blows closure. It just blows closure, right? And there was another question or comment up there somewhere. No, okay. That's okay. Questions do arise, and questions do appear and disappear. I saw a YouTube video of Gore Vidal the other day. YouTube is marvelous kind of thing also, which expands our object on in a very confusing and fragmenting way, just like all of them. And I saw Gore Vidal being interviewed by someone or other for 2-3 minutes. This part of this could be on YouTube.
It will be.
Terribly confusing. So someone asked Gore, the interviewer asks Gore, so how are things? And Gore says, things fall apart. And he's not a very happy guy. You'll see for yourself if you go for the interview. All right, is there anything more that you want to say before I go on? Because I press on whenever I can. Another half hour, so I can actually press on. Is there anything anyone would like to ask or comment? Is anybody feeling hot? No? Is anybody sort of gasping for breath? Should someone open the door? Do people feel different now? Are people noticing that they actually were feeling hot a few minutes ago compared to the way they're feeling now? It's no simple matter of saying how you feel, because so much of it is a matter of contrast. How you were feeling a minute ago, how you'd like to be feeling, how you think you should be feeling. Okay, so I'm going to show you now, I'm going to make several approaches to kind of hammering on these teachings, because that's what they are. I'll use the Platonic term teachings. I actually started with this one, the History of Political Thought, Paul 320. By the way, my brother Asher and I wrote a book called Everywhere They Are in Chains, Political Theory from Rousseau to Marx, which I heartily recommend to those that were interested in the history of political thought from Rousseau to Marx. I got to tell you a little bit about it now.
I second the recommendation, and I didn't write it, and I won't receive any royalties.
Okay. It's published by Nelson, is it? Nelson?
I don't know. I got it from Robarts.
Right. Okay, anyway, the most interesting thing about this book is the cover. So I have to tell you about it. Because I actually, this is a nice segue, but it won't be irrelevant. I actually promised the Studio Museum in Harlem which is where I saw this painting by the African-American artist Aaron Douglas, to mention the museum whenever I mentioned the cover of the book. So I'm keeping my promise. They gave it to us without charge to put on the cover, as long as we talked up their outfit, which we've done. So Aaron Douglas, this part of the Harlem Renaissance, the African-American artist, he made this incredible series of paintings, one of which we used. This is an image of an African-American slave breaking chains. And it's quite a vivid image, and it's a great cover for a book called Everywhere There Are Chains. You know, we taught it for a few years, and then one year, I think it was a student named Sandra Baden, who is now a judge in the United States, a hanging judge probably, who raised a hand in class and said, how come there's always a man on the cover of the book? How come there's no woman on the cover of the book? So I figured, you know, those were the days when women used to raise their hands and raise questions. I suppose they still do. Why are you teaching on liberty and on utilitarianism and not on the subjection of women? You know, and then we would have to bump up answers. Then probably we would have to actually teach on the subjection of women the next year. You know, that kind of thing. So anyway, which was written by Harriet Taylor. Don't they say that it was written by his friend Harriet Taylor and not by the man himself? So, okay, so I suggested we look at the image. And as we looked at the image, as we paid attention to what we saw at the object level, the artwork on the cover of this book, we could see it wasn't absolutely clear that it was a figure of a man. There was no depiction of sexual characteristics. None. I mean, the human figure was rather top-heavy, which we associate with maleness, but I mean necessarily identified with maleness. So I said maybe it's a woman, or maybe it's both a man. Maybe it's a transsexual, or and then we look closer and we see maybe he or she, or he, she, or whatever locution we use these days, they. Maybe they are not trying to break out of their chains. Maybe they're trying to break into their chains. Because after all, didn't Rousseau say they run headlong towards their chains? That would be neat. How do we know? Is he, she trying to break into them, break out of them, or break into them? Or maybe he, she can't decide. I mean, that's more like politics, isn't it? It's like today we want the chains, tomorrow we throw them off. No, then the next day we got an even heavier set of chains, right? We yearn for our chains, we long for our chains. We get another set of chains. We get chains XL, right? Or chains 2.0, and then we throw those off, etc., etc. I'm beginning to bore you with these obvious truths. So that's a little bit of example of general semantics practice avant l'arrêt. Look. So just at the bare visual level, look. But what was I going to tell you? Oh yes, in that course, I would put this on the board. I was demonstrating, believe it or not, this was in aid of some proposition that I was putting forward about Rousseau's theory of the origins of inequality and the social contract. I won't take the time to explain what the connection is. I put this on the board, and I asked, what is this? Now, of course, after a mere 2 hours of neurolinguistic training of some kind, you're already suspicious of a formulation like that. And what is this? In fact, probably as long as you live, no one will be able to use the old is on you that way without raising their hackles, to coin a phrase. But anyway, I asked them, what is this? Yeah, you know, some people would say, well, it's a 13. It is a 13. Number 13. And others would say, no, or yes, and it's a B. So these are the answers we immediately come up with. It's a 13 and or a B, letter B. Okay, that's correct, children. After all, it's just a third-year course. Yeah? So, just where you were last year, right? So, it depends on the context, that is on the code, in which that image locates itself. So in the code of the Latin alphabet, it's a B. Code for code read label level. In the code of the Latin alphabet, it's a B. So in one code it's a 13, in another code it's a B. And what have I done here? I wonder if they would have corrected me, or they would have just let me skip down the line. In the code of Arabic numerals.
You'd have figured it out when you saw the video later.
So in the code of Arabic numerals, it's a 13. See, I can say this as long as I precede it with in the code of. In the code of the Latin alphabet, it's a B. And that's about as far as we go for a while. And then I insist, what is it? But what is it, really? What is it, really? And people kind of escape to what is a kind of primitive version of an understanding of the event. They'll say, it's chalk dust. Or they'll say, it's just those lines. So when they do this, they're actually trying to use language here at a very elementary label level, which we're later going to call sensory grounded language. They're trying to use language that is as close as possible to the actual sensory experience without interpretation. So you could use sensory grounded language, which I wouldn't even call it L1, I would call it L0. Sensory grounded language. Chalk dust or just those lines. But notice, it's still language. I mean, the minute Korzybski says, who says anything is theorizing. That's pretty radical. Whoever says anything is theorizing. So, it's not the same as just those lines. It's not the same as chalk dust. We're not going to identify the formulation, just those lines, or the formulation of chalk dust. That's what we can actually see there and maybe feel in some sense too. Sneeze. Well, they've zeroed in on the object level per se, on just what we see, hear, or feel without, before any codes have been superimposed on them. And what I'm moving towards here is the introduction of the notion of silent practice. So there will be a whole series of silent practices which will consist in your tasks for the next little while. Not today, but next time I'll assign the first silent practice task. Look, if we say it's both a 13 and a B, that's really not gone very far. And if we say it's just those lines or it's chalk dust, that's okay, but that doesn't go as far as we go either. We've got to think about all the things that it could be. Like it could be 24 million served daily. Yeah. No? It could be somebody sitting on a bench. Right? So partly the idea of silent practice is not only to learn to not identify, label an object, but also to kind of resurrect the possibilities for different experience which are kind of hidden at the object level, which are usually obfuscated by the labels that are applied, whether 13 or B or 24 million served or somebody sitting on a bench. More on that later. There's no way one wishes to get away from language or from using language. What Korzybski wants is what he calls consciousness of abstraction. So that's the purpose of general semantics as a neurolinguistic training, is consciousness of abstraction. So instead of copying animals who are not conscious of abstraction, we have the potential to be conscious of abstraction and practice consciousness of abstraction. That is, the label is not the object and the object is not the event. Which reminds me of the Zen story. Actually, I wrote it down here, and that's why I can remember the famous Zen story, which there's lots of Zen stories with an old monk and a young monk. They're sitting side by side, they're having a little discussion. The most famous one is probably an old monk, an old wizened monk. He's sitting there, and beside him there's the young monk, the novice, the newbie, all bright and eager. And the young one says to the old one, "So what happens now?" And the old one says, "Nothing. This is it." And the other story, the one that is more relevant, is about the young one saying to the old one, "How can we get to a place that is beyond concepts and words?" See, because that's the Zen, especially Buddhist version of silent practice. How can we get to a place which is beyond concepts and words? And the old one says, "What are you talking about?" And it's like Derrida's famous discussion of how to avoid speaking. Derrida wrote this essay, probably originally in speech, where he goes on and on, page after page, as he does, on the question of how to avoid speaking. Like, I've been called here today to speak to you all about this very interesting question of speaking and about how to avoid speaking. And I shall go on and on about it. Now, many years after coming across this thing with the 13, or B, I came across in the online magazine Discovery, 2006, a few years ago. Some social psychologists they get grant money to fool around with all kinds of pointless questions. And some of them are maybe a tad interesting. But one of them was, one of these experiments, they were playing with this. So they were flashing this on screen. They love to flash things on screen. For undergraduates, 50 cents an hour. They flash things on screen. They were asking what it is, a 13 or a B. They were doing more or less in the experimental mode that I was doing here. But what they discovered was that if volunteers, that if they were told, volunteers told them that a letter would get them orange juice, if they saw a B, they would get orange juice. So those who were told they would get orange juice were more likely to see B. And those who were told that they would get orange juice if they saw 13 were more likely to see 13. Okay? So, look, we're going to sell out for a glass of orange juice. Okay? So, what happens when we get to the really serious questions? Well, I don't know, maybe we can get back to that in some way, shape, or form later. Now then, I'm just going to introduce this. I'm going to introduce two bits that I'll take up. I'll start from there next time on this thing about cumulative will really be felt in our bones, because if you weren't here today and you come here next time, it won't be what it ought to be. One of my favorite authors is an American anthropologist named Dorothy Lee, actually a Greek woman who married an American and changed her name to Lee. And she lived in the United States, and she was a kind of anthropologist who didn't do any field work. She was a kind of armchair anthropologist, but she was very interested in languages, especially in hunter-gatherer languages. And she used her study of hunter-gatherer languages in order to cast light on many different subjects. She has 2 books that would be on your reading list if we had a reading list. And one of them is called Valuing the Self. And the other one is called Freedom and Culture. And they're actually compendia of her essays rather than. So she wrote one of her essays is called Non-Lineal and Lineal Codifications of Reality. Lineal and non-lineal codifications of reality, which is chapter 10 of Freedom and Culture, and which was published in etc. the Journal of General Semantics, which is where I found it, and that's how I found out about Dorothy Lee and went on to read her other stuff. What she based this particular article on was the famous Bronislaw Malinowski's study of Trobriand. So Malinowski, in the course of his detailed study of Trobriander life, describes the Trobriander villages as concentric circles of huts. There's one circle. Here's another one. Okay, concentric circles of huts. And Lee, studying Trobriander language, and impressed by the Trobriander's non-linear thinking, is unhappy with that description of the layout of Trobriander villages as concentric circles of huts. She thinks that's too linear. And of course, a circle isn't a line. She thinks that's too linear, and she finds very little notion of line in the language of Trobrianders or in their lived experience. She suggests that in their world, that in their words, and also in their world, the language that Malinowski translated as concentric circles of huts, or maybe he didn't even bother finding out what they said in their language about it, but she bothered. She translates it as aggregates of bumps. So what Malinowski saw as concentric circles of huts, he saw their villages as, okay, so here we have label and object working together. He saw them as concentric circles of huts. If you asked him what you see there, he would say, I see concentric circles of huts. It sounds like good sensory grounded language. It's not heavily theory laden. At least it doesn't sound like it at first hearing. But Lee doesn't even see it as. It's like she feels it as. She sort of empathically with the Trobrianders feels it as aggregates of bumps. You can't really see that. Well, I guess you could see it as aggregates of bumps, but this is more see-feel, right? Lee is more into the see-feel, and Malinowski is more into the see. And she goes on to describe Trobriander life in terms of non-linear experience of living, which I will go on next time. I stop that there and I open up another window. Well, from the Trobrianders, as delivered by Malinowski and Lee, we now travel to the world of the North American baby. All of this is to introduce the next set of tasks, which are silent practice tasks, which involve close attention to a sensory experience and to the difference between object and label levels. So now we go to the diary of a baby. A very nice little book written by a child study guy named Daniel Stern. This is such a nice little book. It's one of the very few books that I gave as a gift to my mother. May she rest in peace. And she liked it. Psychologists used to think that babies' sensory experience was chaotic and jumbled. That was the science maybe of 1933. And how you're going to treat babies partly depends on what the scientists will tell you and the sensory experience is, right? There's another example of the highest label level affecting the moment. But more recently, child study people find that babies actually have quite distinct and to them, you could say, meaningful sense of coherent, organized sensory experiences. They're very valuable for us because pre-linguistic babies are engaging in silent practice without having been told to do so or trained to do so. So in a way, silent practice is about going back to our experience as babies and somehow bringing that back into our experience as adults. Not as Rousseau, not as Voltaire would have had it Rousseau to crawl around on our hands and knees, but to go back to crawling around on our hands and knees and to bring the ability to bring back and to set up capacities back to our ordinary experience of the life world. So if you could magically give yourself the ability that a 6-week-old baby has to use English. That's what English really. If you were able to use English to describe your experience as a 6-year-old baby would have, that would be a part of the silent practice. Now, let me tell you what he says on pages 26 and 27. 6-week-old Joey. So this is an actual baby that's studying in a crib. He gets fascinated by looking at the bars. Joey gets fascinated by looking at the bars of the crib. To baby Joey, the crib bar has certain abstract qualities, says Stern. The paradox here is we're going to use highly abstract language to describe our experience in a sensory specific way. Straightness, an elongated thin shape, bright highlights where the varnish reflects light. Highlights where the varnish reflects light. High density. Sharpness of outline against a more diffuse background, and so on. So Stern, empathizing with the baby, reads the baby's experience. Baby can't describe it this way, but Stern describes it this way, as the baby. And then what startled me when I first read this, and I couldn't make sense of it, but later working with the general semantics, I understood it. Stern says each of these experiences of the crib bar is visual, and I guess he's touching it also to get the high density. Each of these experiences of the crib bars evokes a feeling of joy. How does Stern know that it evokes a feeling in joy? Well, by interpreting joy as gestures and facial expressions. And then he notices there's another crib bar, and he notices a difference between the bars, even though it is slight. Differences in distance, shading, angle of view, and so on. Here's a precise description of the visual experience of a baby in a crib looking at the crib bars, which is going to be a model, a partial model for us in the silent practice texts. This is innocence. okay, you know the story of the tree of life and the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. Where do you think language kicks in? So it's a story of innocence. What the Zenists call it is beginner's mind. So this is beginner's mind. It's 6-week-old baby's mind, and it's our mind also insofar as we have any use for it. And the point of living in a highly technological civilization is that we don't have any use for it. And therefore, as a potential, it's repressed or obfuscated. There's no market for it. There's another way of putting that. There's no way of commodifying it. There's another way of putting that. So Joey will be our role model, at least in part, for the sound practice tasks that I will begin to assign next time. After going back to the Trollbranders, here's a little lure for your attendance next time, or maybe it'll put you off, I don't know. Either a lure or not a lure. When we go back to the Trollbranders, we will begin by talking about their sex lives. Okay? Which also happens at the object level. I'm told you can buy men.